G'day, this is Chris Savage from Our Real Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Zechariah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you. So welcome tonight to the book of Zechariah. We're looking at chapter 12, verse 1 to chapter 13, verse 9. Next week will be our last night for Zechariah, and then we'll think about what we're going to do next this year. Last session, what did we see? We saw Zechariah spoke about the restoration of Israel. There's going to be a regathering of Israel as a result of redemption. As a shepherd whistles for his sheep, so Israel will recognize their true shepherd and they will respond. Now, Zechariah prophesies of a time in the future where the temple that they were currently restoring would be destroyed and the land would be devastated. And the reason for this devastation would be the rejection of the true shepherd. And this came about in AD 70 when Zechariah prophesied their leaders would sell out the flock, sell out Israel to get rich, and their possessors, the Romans, would slaughter them. And that did come to pass in AD 70. This is a time when God had removed his mercy from Israel. Zechariah tells us why this took place. And in doing so, he takes on the role of a shepherd. And in this case, representing the Messiah, he takes two staves, beauty, representing graciousness, protection of the flock, and bands, representing binding, which was keeping the flock together. And Zechariah, as a shepherd, he fed the flock of slaughter, representing all Israel. And we see there that the poor of the flock represented the believing remnant of that day. He says that he cut off 3 shepherds in 1 month. And we know from history and from who Zechariah is talking about that these represented the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes. Why? Because there was a mutual antagonism between the good shepherd and these 3 other shepherds. So there was a separation of the people as a whole from the good shepherd. The staff beauty was now broken, signifying that grace and protection was removed from the flock. The unpardonable sin had been committed when they rejected the good shepherd Jesus on the basis that he was demon possessed. And we see that in Matthew chapter 12. Now, when it came time for the shepherd to be paid, Zechariah is telling us all this here, when it came time for the shepherd to be paid, they weighed out 30 pieces of silver. And we saw that 30 pieces of silver is the price of contempt. It's the price of a dead slave. And here God speaks to Zechariah and says, cast it to the potter. Why? Because God says that he himself was being sold out for the price of a dead slave, the price of contempt. The other staff that Zechariah had, bands, was now cut. So the bond of brotherhood between Judah and Israel was now broken. And the unity of the Jews was broken, leading to civil strife, with the result that in AD 70, Jerusalem fell to the Romans, the Jews were scattered, all fulfilled then. There was civil strife between those who were in Jerusalem, and it caused the Romans to be able to take over. Now, Zechariah now speaks about another shepherd coming after this good shepherd, and this was the foolish shepherd. And he will have, this foolish shepherd is going to have no care or concern for the flock. He will destroy the flock to become rich. Remember, the flock is Israel here. Zechariah plays the role to show that one will arise from Israel like this foolish shepherd. And this we see from history was Simon Bar Kokhba. And he was the first person, the first one after the true Messiah to be declared the Messiah by the rabbis. He neither watched over the flock or protected it. He brought, what he did was he brought further division between those who believed in Messiah and those who rejected him. And devastation now comes because of the rejection of the true shepherd and because of the acceptance of the foolish shepherd as the Messiah. This now brings us to the end of the first burden of Zechariah. We're now going to move into the second burden, which we're going to see here from chapter 12, verse 1 to chapter 14, verse 21. And this is the fourth and last major section of the book of Zechariah. Now, a little bit of a summary here. He's now dealing with the second burden of the word of Jehovah, and here's a little summary before we move on. Zechariah deals here with the final campaign against Israel, during which Israel is purged, saved, and redeemed from their enemies. And this is all followed by the establishment of the Messianic kingdom, or the millennial kingdom. Basically, chapters 12 to 14 will provide more details about how the events of chapters 9 to 11 are going to be fulfilled. In chapter 12, verses 1 to 9, we have the campaign of Armageddon. The burden of the word of Jehovah concerning Israel. Thus says Jehovah, who stretches forth the heavens, lays the foundation of the earth, and forms the spirit of man within him. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of reeling unto all the peoples round about, and upon Judah also shall it be in the siege against Jerusalem. And it shall come to pass in that day that I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all the peoples. All that burden themselves with it shall be sore wounded, and all the nations of the earth shall be gathered together against it. In that day, says Jehovah, I will smite every horse with terror, and his rider with madness. I'll open mine eyes upon the house of Judah, and will smite every horse of the peoples with blindness. The chieftains of Judah shall say in their heart, the inhabitants of Jerusalem are my strength in Jehovah of hosts, their God. Verse 6. In that day will I make the chieftains of Judah like a pan of fire among wood, and like a flaming torch among sheaves, and they shall devour all the peoples round about, on the right hand and on the left. And they of Jerusalem shall yet again dwell in their own place, even in Jerusalem. Jehovah also shall save the tents of Judah first, that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem be not magnified above Judah. In that day shall Jehovah defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and he that is feeble among them at that day shall be as David. The house of David shall be as God, as the angel of Jehovah before them. And it shall come to pass in that day that I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. Okay. Now, I've given you a map, if you like, a map, an image there of the campaign of Armageddon. Remember, the campaign of Armageddon, it's not one single war, it's 8 stages to fulfill this campaign of Armageddon. So in verses 1 to 9, he now deals with this campaign, and it describes the physical deliverance of Israel. And verse 1 begins with the second burden of the word of Jehovah. And this one concerns Israel. This is a message which concerns Israel in particular. Second part of verse 1 deals with a God who is in control. And how does he describe himself? He describes himself in 3 ways here. It says, Jehovah, who stretches forth the heavens. So what's he saying? Jehovah is the one who controls outer space. He lays the foundation of the earth. He's the one who controls the physical earth. And he forms the spirit of man within him. Therefore, God is the one who controls human life. So here we have a description of the God who is in total control. What's the point? The point of what he's saying here is this. Because of who God is, all these prophecies will be fulfilled. The events that they foretell will all be accomplished. Why? Because he is in total control. We see the nations against Jerusalem in verses 2 to 3. So here he points out that Jerusalem will become 2 things to them. Remember, this is in the period of time known as the Campaign of Armageddon. Jerusalem is going to become two things to the nations. When we speak of the nations, it means the Gentiles. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of reeling unto all the peoples round about. So the picture we have here is Jerusalem. It's like a big bowl or a big cup around which all the nations, all the Gentile nations, are going to gather to have a drink. But when the word cup is used symbolically in the scriptures, it is often a symbol of God's judgment. It symbolizes the wrath of God. And we can see this in a few passages there. We see it in Psalm 75, verse 8, Isaiah 51, 17, and 51, 21 to 23. Also, Jeremiah 25, verses 15 to 16, and 51, verse 7 also. So we see it in those passages that the cup has to do with judgment. It's a cup of reeling. He goes on to say that upon Judah also shall it be in the siege against Jerusalem. So this, what does this mean? It means here that when Jerusalem is besieged by these armies of the world, Judah is going to feel it. Judah will be concerned. What we need to take note of here is that there is a distinction being made here, a bit of a separation between Judah and Jerusalem. And we're going to see why in a few more minutes. Verse 3, in verse 3, it says, not only will Jerusalem become a cup of reeling, but it will become a burdensome stone. It shall come to pass in that day that I'll make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all the peoples. This means that it's going to become a stone that is simply too heavy to lift. So these Gentile nations dealing with Jerusalem is going to become too heavy for them to handle. All that burden themselves with it shall be sore wounded. Any nation that tries to pick up the heavy stone that represents Jerusalem, as they pick it up, it will drop between their hands, leaving severe lacerations, cuts. And then he points out the fact is, all the nations of the earth shall be gathered together against it. When is the only time that all the nations of the earth are gathered against Jerusalem is in the campaign of Armageddon. That's the only time. And so at that time, all the nations under the Antichrist will come against Jerusalem. And we can see this in Joel chapter 3, verses 9 to 13. And again, we'll see it next week in Zechariah chapter 14, verses 1 to 2. So all the nations are now gathered against it under the Antichrist. We see the physical deliverance of Judah and Jerusalem in verses 4 to 9 of chapter 12. In verse 4, he starts out by describing the judgment upon the horses. So this is a judgment upon all the military equipment. The timing of it is in that day. In other words, it's a specific day. It's the campaign of Armageddon. That's the time when this judgment will come. I will smite every horse with terror and his rider with madness. Then God will smite every horse of the peoples with blindness. Because they're terror-stricken and blind, and their riders also become mad themselves, these horses will run headlong to their own destruction. Now, under the Mosaic covenant, God said that these judgments would come upon the Jews for disobedience. And we see that in 28, verse 28. And what God once pronounced upon the Jews, he will now pronounce upon the Gentiles because of their movement against the Jews. And here, again, what we see here is the outworking of the principle of Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. I will bless them that bless you, and him that curses you, I will curse, or will I curse. Then he goes on to say in verse 4, I will open mine eyes upon the house of Judah. So while their enemies are blinded, God's eyes will be open as he looks upon Judah. He's not just simply looking to see where they are. He knows where they are. He's not seeing how things are going. That's not what it means. It means he's looking out for their protection. He will keep his eyes upon them in order to protect them from the Gentile armies. Again, note here again that Judah is distinguished from Jerusalem. And here we have in verses 5 to 6 of chapter 12, the energizing of the Jews of Judah. What's the source of this energizing? He says here, the chieftains of Judah shall say in their heart, the inhabitants of Jerusalem are my strength in Jehovah of hosts, their God. Notice here that Judah's strength is in Jehovah, their strength. That is, in Jerusalem's God. So Judah's strength is found in Jerusalem's God, Jehovah. So the picture here is of the Jews of Jerusalem forming one entity and the Jews of Judah forming another entity. The Jews of Judah who are away from Jerusalem, where are they? Well, we know that they are in Bozrah or Petra at this time, southern Jordan. They will be receiving moral and spiritual strength from the way in which the inhabitants of the city are withstanding the enemy. Now, in this future day, there'll be something similar. Remember the flight in Jerusalem? And once again, what we're going to see here is that Judah and Jerusalem are distinguished as separate entities. So the source here of the moral strength for the Jewish army in Judah will be the stand that the Jerusalemites or the Jerusalem Jews take against the enemy, as well as coming from God. So they are greatly encouraged the way that they see the Jews in Jerusalem fighting. And verse 6 now describes how this energizing will work. In that day, always that day, it's a specific day. It's the campaign of Armageddon. In that day, I will make the chieftains of Judah like a pan of fire among wood and like a flaming torch among sheaves. God's going to so energize the Jewish forces that they become like a flame of fire among the Gentiles that has become like dry wood. Fire applied to dry wood causes it to burn very quickly. A flame among the dry sheaves will soon have the whole field alight. There's going to be two results from this energizing. First of all, it says that they shall devour all the peoples round about. The Jewish forces will cause massive decimation among the enemy on the right hand and on the left. Second, and they of Jerusalem shall yet again dwell in their own place, even in Jerusalem. So ultimately, as a result of this energizing, the Jerusalemites will be able to return and live in the city once again. And once again, Judah and Jerusalem, we see that they're separate entities here. And to a certain degree here, Judah will help in rescuing Jerusalem. By this energizing, the forces of the enemy will be further lacerated, further cut. Remember, Jerusalem will become a burdensome stone and a cup of reeling. And in verse 7, he promises that Judah will be saved. Jehovah also shall save the tents of Judah first. Now, the fact that Judah is living in tents and not in houses points out that they're not living in the land of Judah, which was their permanent dwelling place. Instead, this emphasizes that they're living in temporary dwellings outside the land. Now, as we've seen before, most of the Jews who survive this period make their way down to the ancient city of Bozrah or Petra in southern Jordan. And the point of this first phrase here in verse 7 is to show that the Jews of Bozrah would be saved before God saves the Jews of Jerusalem. And that is the reason why the prophet has been making the distinction between them throughout the passage. The Jerusalem Jews will be saved after the tents of Judah are saved. Now, why? Well, simply because of this. We know from Micah chapter 2, verse 13, and Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 3, that Messiah will come to Bozrah first. Isaiah Isaiah also says the same thing. Isaiah 34, 1-7, and Isaiah 63, 1-6. The reason God will save the tents of Judah first is so that two other groups would not be magnified above Judah. That the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem not be magnified above Judah. And for that reason, he's going to save the tents of Judah first. And then in verse 8, he now discusses the energizing of the Jews of Jerusalem. First, he considered the Jews of Judah, who were in hiding down in Petra or Bozrah. Now he looks at the Jews of Jerusalem. And he points out that in that day shall Jehovah defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and he will do it in two ways. First, it says the feeble among them in that day shall be as David. So the weakest among the Jewish forces will fight like King David did. And second, and the house of David shall be as God, as the angel of Jehovah. So those who are the future Davids among the Jews, those who are fighting men amongst the Jews, will fight like the angel of Jehovah, who, as we see here in this verse, as this verse here shows us, it brings it here. It's not an ordinary angel, but it is God himself. In actual fact, it's the second person of the Godhead. It's the Messiah. The house of David, like God, like the angel of Jehovah. So angel of Jehovah is God in the second person. He is the mighty one, because if you go back to Isaiah 37, 36, this angel of Jehovah once killed 185,000 Assyrians in one night. So that gives us some idea of the impact of this statement in relation to the Jewish forces in Jerusalem. They're gonna fight mightily. And then finally in verse 9, we have the judgment of the Gentiles. It shall come to pass in that day that I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. So at this point, God declares that he intends to destroy all the fighting forces of all the nations involved in the Armageddon campaign against Jerusalem, or against the Jews. Once again, this emphasizes the principle of Genesis 12, verse 3. I will bless them that bless you, and him that curses you will I curse. Now, the order in which this judgment takes place is that God will first rescue the Jews in Bozrah or Petra, destroying many of the Antichrist armies there. This is actually the 6th stage of the campaign of Armageddon. So secondly, he will then rescue. So he moves from Bozrah. He will then move from Bozrah back to Jerusalem, where he rescues the Jews of Jerusalem. This is the 7th stage of the campaign of Armageddon. And as a result, he will destroy the final portions of the armies just outside Jerusalem in the valley of Jehoshaphat. This destruction of all the nations that come against Jerusalem will comprise the 6th and 7th stages of the campaign of Armageddon. But before he can permanently and firmly and finally destroy them, he must first bring about Israel's national salvation. So first of all must come the national regeneration of Israel. And this is going to bring us to the next section. This is the salvation. This section now deals with the salvation and the spiritual deliverance of Israel in two areas. We're going to see their mourning for the Messiah to return and the spiritual cleansing of Jerusalem. Now, this is verse 10, and I'll pour up on the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the spirit of grace and of supplication. They shall look unto me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. In that day there shall be great mourning in Jerusalem, as the mourning of Hadad-rimmon in the valley of Megiddon. And the land shall mourn every family apart, the family of the house of David apart, and their wives apart, the family of the house of Nathan apart, and their wives apart, the family of the house of Levi apart, and their wives apart, The family of the Shimeites apart and their wives apart. All the families that remain, every family apart and their wives apart. Chapter 13, verse 1. In that day, there shall be a fountain open to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and uncleanness. So we see the mourning of Messiah in verses 10 to 14 of chapter 12. In verse 10, we see the pleading for Messiah to return. The cause of Israel's pleading will be, I will pour the Spirit, I'll pour out the Spirit of grace and supplication. The Holy Spirit will be poured out upon the entire Jewish nation, and he will be poured out as an outpouring of grace, and it's the grace of God is what leads one to salvation. Also, this is going to include supplication. Why? Because the grace of God will move upon them to turn to God and to plead for their salvation and for Messiah's return. So this outpouring of the Spirit upon Israel, resulting in Israel's salvation, is also brought out for us in Isaiah chapter 32, verses 13 to 20, 44, 3 to 5, and also in Joel chapter 2, verse 28 to 32. And we see it in Acts chapter 2, verse 16 to 21, which is using Joel as an illustration there. Now, we see here that there are two groups upon whom the Spirit is going to fall. Upon the house of David, or the royal house, and second, upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So what we see here, it is this that will result in their looking unto me, whom they have pierced. And now, the word dakar, D-I-Q-A-R, which is for pierced here, the Hebrew for pierced, it means to be thrust through. And this is a reference to the spear which pierced Jesus's side, recorded for us in John chapter 19, verse 37. So the outpouring of the Holy Spirit upon the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem is going to result in them looking unto the one whom they have pierced. Now, there's just something here. If you've got a King James Bible, for instance, some translations, the King James, for instance, shall look upon me, implying that the Messiah first comes, and once they've seen him, then they'll repent. But that's not what the Hebrew word means here. It means unto, because why? Because he's not here. He's away. He's aloft. He's on high. So they're looking. So after they've looked onto him, this is going to result in their salvation, which results in his return. Because remember, Israel's national salvation is the prerequisite for the second coming. So until Israel is saved, Messiah does not return. And then he now describes the mourning for the Messiah. Once they've recognized and realized that that one whom they had pierced before, 2,000 plus years ago, once they recognize that he is the Messiah, they then mourn for him. And it says that they shall mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one who is in bitterness for his firstborn. What this does here, it emphasizes the intensity of their mourning that will take place. Now, in the world of that day, there was greater mourning for the loss of a firstborn son than for the loss of any other child. The mourning for Messiah is not only a mourning for the loss, but also a mourning that this son might come back and be restored to life. This is the kind of mourning that the Jewish people will have in that day for the Messiah. They're going to mourn over the fact that Israel rejected his messiahship at his first coming, but they'll also mourn that he might come back. And indeed, he's going to come back, because that's the prerequisite for his return. And in verse 11, he points out that this period of mourning will be like it was when King Josiah died. In that day, there shall be a great mourning in Jerusalem. And he compares it here with the mourning of Hadad Rimmon in the valley of Megiddo. The mourning he's referring to is described in 2 Chronicles 35, verses 22 to 25, where there was a great mourning as a result of the death of the good King Josiah. He was the last of Jerusalem's good kings. King Josiah was killed in the war against the Egyptians at Hadad Rimmon. From that time on, there was a continuous downward spiral toward Jerusalem's own destruction. The national mourning for the Messiah will be like that time in the specific locality of Hadad Rimmon, where Josiah was killed in the valley of Megiddo. In verse 12, he now describes the mourning of the royal house. First of all, generally, the land shall mourn, every family apart. So that's everybody's going to be mourning. Then second, he gets specific. He says the house of David apart and their wives apart. The house of David was the largest segment of the royal house. The house of Nathan apart and their wives apart. This was the least recognized line of the house of David. But it was from the line of Nathan that Messiah came. In verse 13, he describes the mourning of the priestly house. It says the family of the house of Levi apart and their wives apart. The house of Levi was the greatest in that tribe. Then the family of the Shimeites apart and their wives apart. Well, who were the Shimeites? Well, the Shimeites were the least recognized in the tribe of Levi. So these two verses describe the mourning in Israel from the greatest to the least in the royal house and also in the priestly house. And then finally in verse 14, he describes the mourning of the people. All the families that remain, every family apart and their wives apart. So what we see here is that the entire nation, and especially the whole city of Jerusalem, will go into intense mourning over the Messiah. In that day, here comes the spiritual cleansing of Israel. In that day, there shall be a fountain open to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness. So this national mourning and salvation leads us to chapter 13, verse 1, where we have the spiritual cleansing of Jerusalem. The timing is in that day. This is also part of the Armageddon campaign. In that day, there shall be a fountain open. Now, in the Old Testament, a fountain was the means of cleansing for ceremonial uncleanness. But here, it symbolizes the outpouring of the Holy Spirit through Messiah Jesus and their faith in him. And this will become available, he says, through the Spirit who was poured out, which we saw back in verse 10 of chapter 12. So this comes as a place of cleansing to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. The purpose of it is to remove two types of problems. First of all, for sin. Sin here refers to judicial guilt resulting from violation of the law, whether the Mosaic law or the law of Messiah requiring justification. As a result of this fountain of the Holy Spirit, Israel will now be justified, declared righteous. Judicial guilt will be removed, and they will now be declared righteous before God. Second, for uncleanness. And now this refers to moral guilt requiring sanctification. So, as a result of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit and of Israel's national salvation, when they look on to the Messiah, Israel as a nation will be sanctified. So the Jewish people in that day will experience both justification and sanctification. Now we come to the spiritual cleansing of the land. It's verse 2 to 6. It shall come to pass in that day, says Jehovah of hosts, that I will cut off the names of the idols out of the land, and they shall no more be remembered. And also I will cause the prophets and the unclean spirit to pass out of the land. It shall come to pass that when any shall yet prophesy, then his father and his mother that begat him shall say unto him, you shall not live, for you speak lies in the name of Jehovah. His father and mother that begat him shall thrust him through when he prophesies. Verse 4, it shall come to pass in that day that the prophets shall be ashamed every one of his vision when he prophesies. Neither shall they wear a hairy mantle to deceive. When he shall say, I'm no prophet, I'm a tiller of the ground, for I have been made a bondman from my youth. And one shall say unto him, what are these wounds between your arms? Then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. In these verses here, Zechariah describes here the cleansing of the land, which will naturally follow the cleansing of the nation from sin and uncleanness. And verse 2 deals with the judgment against all sources of pollution. And he starts it here with the timing. It says, it shall come to pass in that day. And that is, this is going to happen in conjunction with Israel's salvation. There will be a removal of three things in particular. First, I will cut off the names of the idols out of the land. Idolatry will be completely eradicated to the point, he says, where they shall no more be remembered. Idolatry will be removed in its finality. Remember, when the image of the Antichrist is destroyed, and we see that comes out of Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. That's the final idol in the land, and that will be destroyed. Second, concerning false prophets, I will cause the prophets to pass out of the land. Third, concerning demons, I will cause the unclean spirits to pass out of the land. So all the sources of spiritual pollution, idolatry, false prophets, demons, will be cleansed out of the land. Now, during the Messianic kingdom, all demons will be confined in one of two places. Some will be confined in Babylon. We see from Isaiah chapter 13, 21 to 22. And we saw that in our Revelation study in Revelation 18, verse 2. And there are some others going to be confined in Edom, which is down southern Jordan. We see that in Isaiah 34, 8 to 15. Both of these places, Babylon and Edom, will be a continuously burning wasteland. And throughout the Messianic kingdom, all sources of spiritual pollution will be cleansed out of the land of Israel. Now, the rest of this section here emphasizes the removal of the false prophets. And verse 3 deals with the killing of the false prophets that will take place in conjunction with Israel's national regeneration. It shall come to pass that when any shall yet prophesy, what we're doing here is showing here that the false prophets will continue to be in rebellion against God, even after the majority have come to realize the truth that Jesus is the Messiah. Then his father and his mother that begat him shall say unto him, you shall not live. The parents of any false prophet will sentence him to death. And their reason is, for you speak lies in the name of Jehovah. As a result, his father and mother that begat him shall thrust him through when he prophesies. They'll execute him themselves, because their son is a false prophet. Hebrew word for thrust through, which is used against a false prophet here, is the same word used of the Messiah earlier in chapter 12, verse 10. It's the same as that which is translated as pierced. And this is what the Old Testament required. False prophets were to be executed in accordance with Deuteronomy 13, verses 6 to 10, and Deuteronomy 18, verses 20 to 22. Now, this is a real national transformation because instead of being zealous for these sins of idolatry, false prophecy, and demonic activity, they will show themselves zealously against these very same things after their national regeneration. Total turnaround. And verses 4 to 6 now describes the hunt that will go on to flush out the false prophet. Verse 4 deals with the shame of the false prophets. Again, Zechariah spells out the timing. It shall come to pass in that day. That is, it will happen in conjunction with the cleansing of the land and the destruction of the false prophets. The prophet shall be ashamed, every one of his vision when he prophesies. Why? They're going to be ashamed because their false prophecies did not come true. The lack of any fulfillment is always one of the key evidences that they are false prophets. Now, these very things are the evidence that they need to be executed. Neither shall they wear a hairy mantle to deceive. Often, true prophets would wear a hairy mantle, and false prophets would do the same so as to imitate the true prophet. And the wearing of a hairy mantle was a mark of a prophet in the Old Testament. And we see this in 1 Kings 19:13, 2 Kings 1, verse 8 to 8 and 13. And then in the New Testament, we see it in Matthew chapter 3, verse 4, and Mark chapter 1, verse 6, speaking about John the Baptist. Now, when they become ashamed of their prophecies and realize that they're being sought out to be executed, they're going to discard their hairy mantles. They're going to throw them away so that they'll not be seen as prophets any longer. They've changed their tune. They're trying to escape. And in verse 5 to 6, we see the section here now concludes with a dialogue. And verse 5 points out that these false prophets who once so readily claimed to be true prophets are now going to deny that they were ever a prophet. But he will say, I'm no prophet. I'm a tiller of the ground. He's going to claim that I've never been a prophet. Let me, I've always been a farmer. In fact, he says, for I've been made a bondman from my youth. So he claims to be not only a farmer, but someone who had been enslaved as a farm worker from the time he was a young lad. Now, it was a practice of false prophets, not only to imitate a true prophet by wearing a hairy mantle, but also to mark their bodies and cause scars. And this is something true prophets never ever did. For example, we see in the contest between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, the prophets of Baal cut themselves. And we see that in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 28. So while the false prophets will be able to cast away the hairy mantles, they'll not be able to remove the scars from their bodies. So in verse 6, we see how they will try to explain them away when anyone calls attention to them. As they're undergoing this interrogation procedure, the question will be raised. Well, what are these wounds between your arms? Now, normally, these would have been a sure sign of a false prophet. Then shall he answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. He will claim that it was done while he was fooling around at his friend's house and was wounded in the process. But such deceits will not succeed in deterring the searchers, and he'll find himself being executed. Now, this verse here, sometimes this verse has been pulled out of context and been made to refer to the Messiah. But remember, a text apart from its context is a pretext. Verse 6 here is a part of the context on the subject of false prophets that began back in verse 2. It is part of this dialogue here, which began with verse 5. Therefore, verse 6 is not a reference to the true Messiah. It is a reference to the false prophets of the tribulation who will be executed at that time as part of the spiritual cleansing of the land. Not Messiah. Now we have the summary of Israel's relationship to the Messiah in verses 7 to 9. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd and against a man that is my fellow, says Jehovah of hosts. Smite the shepherd and the sheep shall be scattered. And I'll turn my hand upon the little ones. And it shall come to pass that in all the land, says Jehovah, 2 parts therein shall be cut off and die, but a 3rd part shall be left therein. And I'll bring the 3rd part into the fire and will refine them as silver is refined, and will try them as gold is tried. They shall call on my name, and I'll hear them. I will say, it is my people, and they shall say, Jehovah is my God. So now, before Zechariah proceeded with further details concerning the second coming and the establishment of the kingdom in chapter 14, he summarizes here Israel's relationship to the Messiah. And in his summary, Zechariah makes 3 points here. The Messiah's rejection at his first coming, the results of his rejection, and the salvation of the Jewish remnant. So in the first part of verse 7, he begins with the rejection of the Messiah. He starts out by saying, "Awake, O sword." The sword here is a symbol of death. It does not describe the manner of execution, but rather it symbolizes death itself, pointing out that Messiah will be killed violently. This sword is to awake against my shepherd, and by calling him the shepherd, God is emphasizing Messiah's humanity. This is referring to the messianic shepherd that Zechariah spoke about earlier in chapter 11, verses 4 to 14. But then he says, "Against the man that is my fellow, says Jehovah of hosts." By calling him the man, again, Messiah's humanity is being emphasized. But where he is called my fellow or my companion, the Hebrew word is amiti, which literally means my equal. This emphasizes his deity as Jehovah's equal. So the shepherd is God. It's the second person of the Godhead, Messiah. Literally, what we see here is that the passage reads, "Awake, O sword, against my shepherd and against the man that is my equal." And for this one to be God's equal, it means that he must be God himself. Here is one of those Old Testament examples of the God-man concept. The one who is going to be killed is the good shepherd, but he is also God and man. So this verse here speaks of the rejection of the Messiah at his first coming, and the rejection was by means of a violent death, by means of crucifixion. Second part of verse 7 and to verse 8, he now deals with the results of that rejection. And here is the rest of this is a summary of what he said back in verses 4 to 14 of chapter 11. "Smite the shepherd and the sheep shall be scattered." The shepherd was smitten in the year AD 30 and the flock was scattered in AD 70. This passage here is applied directly to the scattering of the disciples when Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane back in Matthew chapter 26, verse 31 to 32. But its primary reference is to the dispersion that happened in AD 70 when the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. He concludes this verse here by saying, "I will turn my hand upon the little ones." This means here that even the innocent common people will suffer as a result of the rejection of the true shepherd by their leaders. So, first result of the smiting of the shepherd in AD 30 is the forced dispersion of the flock in AD 70. Second result of the smiting of the good shepherd is in verse 8, which is the death of 2/3 of the flock. It shall come to pass that in all the land, says Jehovah, 2 parts therein shall be cut off and die. And the Hebrew word eretz is a usual word for earth here. So what we see is here. So in all the land or all the earth, 2/3 of the Jewish people who are alive at the beginning of the Great Tribulation will not survive to the end of it. They're going to be killed in that persecution. And this you can find this in Matthew 24, verses 15 to 28, Matthew 24, 15 to 28, and Revelation chapter 12, verse 6 to 17. However, this verse now ends with a promise. "But the third shall be left therein." So 1/3 of the Jewish population is going to survive. And this is the all Israel of Romans 11 that is going to be saved. This is the nation that is going to experience salvation. So in verse 9, he deals with the salvation of the surviving third. He makes 3 statements about them, about how they'll come to salvation. First of all, he says, "I will bring the third part into the fire." Second, "I will refine them as silver is refined." Third, "I will try them as gold is tried." So the fires of the trial that will refine them are the judgments of the Great Tribulation. And by means of these judgments, they will learn righteousness and come to salvation. And this is also brought out here by three statements. First of all, they shall call on my name and I will hear them. So excuse me. So the surviving remnant will turn to the Lord and call upon him in saving faith. Second, I will say, it is my people. Now, the prophet Hosea mentioned that while the Jews are while the Jews are always God's people positionally, they only experience what it means when they're in a right relationship with him. And now what we're going to see here, at this point in time, the Jewish people will become God's people again experientially. This is the 1/3 that survives the tribulation and comes to faith. And third, they shall say, Jehovah is my God. They'll accept God, and with the acceptance of the one true God will come the acceptance of the Jewish Messiah. And that brings us to the end of tonight's study. There are contact details there if you need to contact us. Let me